You've joined the Betamax Video Club, rewinding back to our favourite films of the 1980s. My name's Rich Nelson, and tonight I've rented Big. Watching it with me is Chris Oakley from Kit Bliss. Hi, Chris, how are you?
I'm very good. Thanks very much, Rich. It's good to be here. How are you?
I'm very good. And a little note to everyone that Chris designed the logos and the website banner, so
Blame
good to
me.
finally have you on. So that we're talking. This was about 9 months ago, wasn't it?
It
So
was,
it's good
wasn't
to finally get this podcast recorded. So, Big was one of the films that you suggested. How was it this time?
it was really good, actually. I can't honestly remember last time I saw it. It was going back many, many years. I didn't see it when it was first released. And so therefore I'd sort of forgotten a lot about what was in the film. I have sort of a few, like most people, I think, have a few hazy memories of generally what the film's about. But having finally tracked down a copy on DVD, which is harder than you think, I actually really enjoyed it. There was a lot I'd forgotten, and what I think is probably regarded about the film these days is that it's quite it's quite a simple film with a simple plot and so on and so forth. Actually, there's a lot of subtle background themes, let's say, that go through the film, and it actually gives it a bit more depth than perhaps you realise. But that's just one reason why I enjoyed it, amongst other things.
Sort of forget you come to it. I mean, the film came out in 1988, so 30 years ago,
Oh, dear.
and it was, I know, and I remember it being out, and this was Tom Hanks at his sort of really becoming quite a big name. He was, I think, this film came out in between Punchline he did and Turner and Hooch. And
Yes.
it was around the time, it was just after Dragnet and The Burbs and things like that, where he really was a sort of comedy actor. But when you look at some of the other names who were linked at some point to being the lead, and I had a quick look on Google, which big mistake, and it had Robert De Niro,
Yes.
yeah, who admittedly wanted too much money, Robin Williams, and strangely John Travolta.
Yeah. John Travolta was seen as being quite toxic in the movie industry back then, and was a case of no barge poles available, therefore we don't need to try and touch him with it. Yeah, quite bizarre. Actually, so many names connected with the Tom Hanks role.
And it's strange where you sort of look at Tom Hanks then, being, you could believe him almost as certainly as an older teenager anyway, and although he was sort of in his late 20s then, but seeing Robert De Niro in the late 80s, off the back of, I don't know, Midnight Run or just before Goodfellas, playing essentially a 13-year-old boy, that would have made it a very, very different film.
Yeah, I don't get me wrong. I spent a bit of time trying to visualize that, and I really can't see how that would have worked. Apparently, he was very keen on getting the role, and as you say, it was only because of he wanted more money for it than was available for his pay. And I'm not sure I can see him in that role. It just doesn't work somehow. I suppose we sort of used to seeing him in very serious roles and sort of quite sort of violent films in some cases, and quite heavy themes in his films. So it just doesn't work. But what we could have had, eh?
Yeah, I say that there's an alternate universe out there where he made Big instead of Meet the Parents, and perhaps the world's a better place.
Yes, indeed.
Well, I mean, the film itself, as we talked about, and there was a trend in the sort of late 80s of these sort of body swap films. I remember one, Vice Versa, for example. That was one I used to watch quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, well, he was 12, and then I think he had a birthday during the film, didn't he? So
Yeah.
he was 12, and he's a 12-year-old kid. He's got his mate who was the annoying ginger fella from Terminator 2. And it's all very sort of tweed, sort of out New York State, and all he does is he goes to a fun fair, doesn't get on one of the rides because he's too short, and then he finds this very sort of strange machine, which obviously isn't plugged into the wall, and wishes he was big, which, I'll be honest, I'm sure certainly every boy at some point has wished that they were 18 or 19 or older and could do this and do that, and I assume the same is probably true of girls. Is that something you wished for at some point?
I tell you what I would say is I sort of, as a kid, I grew up perhaps trying to be older than I was anyway, because I think my mum and dad, without being too authoritarian about it, they were always quite keen on, like, when I go to school, behave yourself, do what the teacher says, don't cause any trouble, blah, 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 respect your elders and all that kind of stuff. And then as I got to the age of about sort of 12 or 13, I remember sort of discovering BBC radio sort of comedy series and things like I'm Sorry, I Haven't a Clue and whatever. And when you listen to those, you've got people there that went to Oxford or Cambridge, the footlights and all that kind of stuff. And they all seemed very academic and had a very finely honed sense of humour. And I think for me, all these things combined when I was younger, that made me feel like I wanted to be not so much older as just more mature or more intelligent for my age. And I think maybe wrongly in retrospect, I sort of became a bit more serious as a kid. So mentally I was sort of older. I was trying to be older, but physically I didn't ever feel the need to try and be sort of taller or anything like that. And it's kind of interesting as you're describing I guess the underlying plot to the film, and that he needs to be big to get on this fairground ride and stuff. I don't know. I think I always wanted to be seen to be sort of mentally more mature rather than physically, really. I was quite happy to be sort of young and fit and go over to the park and play football with my mates and stuff like that. So it never really occurred to me that I needed to be physically bigger.
I mean, they did well with the casting. I mean, the 12-year-old Josh did look very much like Tom Hanks, and it's a good casting for him. But I can imagine, if you're 12 and you've been to the fun fair the night before and you wake up the next morning and you're Tom Hanks in a bunk bed sharing a room with a toddler. It's that must have freaked him out.
It's quite a nice these things, this whole notion of somebody becoming sort of physically bigger or older or whatever than they were, but still, I'm trying to avoid using the phrase young person trapped in an old person's body, because that has all kinds of other overtones. But that sort of transformation, it's dealt with very nicely in the film. And as you say, there is that there's a scene early on where he's been on this Zoltar Speaks machine at a fun fair, and he's made a wish. He's put his coin in the thing. And then he wakes up, as you say, on his top bunk, and all of a sudden he's this sort of big guy. And it's nice the way it's done, even to the point where he sort of goes into the bathroom to get ready to go to school, and he looks in the mirror and sort of sees himself, and he sees basically Tom Hanks looking back at him, if you like. But there's even the bit where he sort of tugs on his chest hair, because obviously he wouldn't have had that as a kid. Yeah. And then he does the thing where he sort of pulls his boxer shorts out and looks down to where his genitalia are, to sort of see how that's changed as well. It's really nicely done. It's not sort of full on. They don't go crazy with it early on, but it's just a nice sort of drip feed into this notion of, like, actually this is still the same guy, he's just bigger. Really, really good actually the way they deal with all that.
Yeah, and a theme throughout the film is that he is still the 12-year-old. He, while gets a job and he starts having certain responsibilities, but he still does things as a 12-year-old kid. He still acts that way, and it shows that sort of naivety of youthful or 12-year-oldness anyway. You can imagine for his mum as well, when he goes downstairs, this woman is almost like something you'd see out of Goodfellas. Immediately she's like, "What have you done with my son?" Pulls a knife on him. Chases him out of the house. Now, my mum's Irish and would probably do exactly the same thing. It's still, it must be a fright for her. And the fact that he is treated, certainly throughout the film, as a cross between a missing person and being kidnapped.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting how, when I was watching the film, there were a couple of points where I was watching and thinking, surely they could have gone a bit deeper into this narrative or this sort of plot line. And one of the examples was that moment that basically, as you say, he goes back. He goes to the fun fair hoping it's still there, and then I think with the intent of buying another ticket from the Zoltar machine and making a wish and going back to being a 12-year-old again. But it's disappeared. The fun fair's moved on. It's not there anymore. So he goes back, tries to explain to his mum what's happened. And of course, all she sees is this big, tall fella walking into a house and who she thinks is some kind of sexual intruder, presumably. And at that point, the first time I watched the film, because I have watched it twice in the last week, you get the gold star for that one. Basically, I initially sort of thought surely they could have at this point looked a bit deeper into how his mum felt, because it would have been devastating if it had actually happened in real life.
Yeah.
Suddenly your son's not there anymore, and there's a guy walking into your house, essentially saying, "I know your son, and I know why he's not there." But then you sort of think, well, actually, it doesn't need to, of course. It's essentially a fairly lightweight film, and its main purpose is to explain what it would be like for a 12-year-old kid to be big, abnormally so. So it actually doesn't need to go into all that serious stuff. But it's definitely true that if you put yourself in the perspective of his mum, who's played by Mercedes Ruehl, she would have been just absolutely devastated, because you don't know when your son's coming back, you don't know where he's gone, you don't know who's got him, you don't know how they're treating him. So it's quite a deep, dark kind of premise, really, initially, but they don't spend too long in the film dwelling on that. They literally just sort of say, look, this is a side issue, but we're going to go back to Tom Hanks now because it's all about him.
Yeah.
And of course, at that point, then it's, he's Josh's friend Billy basically sort of says you need to kind of hide in New York and get out of the way, otherwise there'll be people sort of searching for you. If you stay in town, there'll be you'll be found as this sort of grown up. So hence why they end up going off to New York.
Well, this is one of the parts of the film that again, coming back to it, so many years later, and the world's changed a lot, I suppose, and I'm more aware of these things, where if you go to a seedy hotel in Times Square as how old Tom Hanks here, I don't know, late 20s, with a 12-year-old boy asking for a room for the night, there should be alarm bells ringing in that hotel. All he does is burp. There should be some sort of safeguards in place, really. I don't know. But
yeah.
Again, I mean, that's a recurring theme throughout as well, that when Tom Hanks, when Josh, I should call him, when he goes for the job interview and they confuse Billy for his son, that actually seems to work a little bit better. It's funny to them and everything, but it's scary. I mean, when I went to New York when I was a bit younger on my own and ended up staying in a youth hostel not far off Times Square, and I can imagine it was a strange place, sharing a room with various other tourists and that, but we didn't hear gunshots anyway, like Josh did.
No, I mean, I guess it's intimidating enough just as being in a city, in a new city on your own. But I mean, New York of all places must have been quite out there, really. And
Billy seems to be very streetwise for a 12-year-old. He seems to be, confident and knows what he's doing, and obviously steals a bit of money and clothes from his dad. He seems a lot more weird than Josh does.
Yeah, but even then, it's quite nice. I mean, you say that, it's just made me think that, and I'd be interested to hear your take on this and anybody else's, really. When I was that age, if you're in a group of, if you hang around with a group of friends, inevitably in the group, one of the kids is going to be a bit on the slow side, and there's always going to be the one kid that's quite kind of intelligent and alert, mentally alert. And I would say in our group, I was the slow one. And I'm not looking for sympathy, everyone. I mean, I'm just saying, just putting it out there, because when I was like 13, I had a friend called Adam Ketley, and he was like, mentally, he was like a 34-year-old. He seemed to know everything. He designed his own sort of like DC comics, sort of comic strips, and not in a crap childish way. Like, he could properly draw, and he was just into playing musical instruments, and he just had a real worldly, wise view of everything. And I could barely sort of tie my own shoelaces at that age. I mean, so it's interesting, that dynamic, that I guess when you're that age, you always hang around with other kids, and some are a bit more intelligent than others. But as you say, Billy seems very switched on, to the point where A, he says you need to go to New York, B, he says you need to check into a hotel, and latterly C, he's aware of the fact that, well, he needs to get a job as well, where Josh needs to get a job, but also the fact that in order to get Josh back to his original self, that they need to find where the next fun fair is, or where all the other fun fairs are in New York. So there's this scene where they go to this sort of public office. I guess it's like the equivalent of a council building or something, and they queue up and sort of they ask for information about whether the fun fairs are going to be in the near future. And here's another thing that shows kind of how far we've gone. Of course, nowadays on the internet, they'd go tap, tap, tap on a keyboard and be able to bring you up the information immediately. And the reply from the woman behind the counter is, fill out this form, you'll hear from us in 6 weeks. And so, which is kind of amusing in itself. But yeah, Billy is far more nuanced about the modern world, I think, than Josh is. I would be Josh in that relationship, I think.
Well, the good thing is, and at least they were self-aware, because in those groups where there's always a slow kid, and I suppose it's one of those scenarios where if you say there's no slow kid, it's probably you. But then one thing I thought about these Zoltar machines was, it's clearly worked on Josh. He's gone to the fun fair. It's found. He's made a wish and it's come true in a literal sense. How many other people has it worked on? Because I imagine this has had some use over the years. And are there no, and again, not everyone will have made the wish to be bigger. They may have had, I don't know, more money, or something even more trivial like, I wish I had a complete Panini World Cup sticker book. But and things like that, and I suppose I'm 38 and still wish for that. But then, where are all these other people trying to get hold of this Zoltar machine? It's can't just be them, surely.
Well, no, but of course the other interesting element to this, which you mentioned earlier, is that Josh managed to sort of make a wish, and yet the machine wasn't even plugged in, which is the kind of little the hook on that. That's it's a bit spooky that. So therefore, presumably everybody else had put their money in when it was plugged in, and that's why they didn't get their wish happened. Like, who knew? And of course, this is reflected at the end of the film. Sorry, just cut this for a spoiler, but basically, when he goes to make a wish again, when he finds a machine again, one of the first things he does is unplugs it to make sure that the wish comes true. So, but yeah, that's the sort of thing. My dad, bless him, my late father, he was a terrible critic of TV shows and films. Like if there was a scene of some guy, I don't know, running through a big puddle and then sort of running on down the street, he'd say, "Look at him, not a spot of water on him. Look, he's bone dry. There's nothing wrong with him." And he was a real terrible cynic about the TV and films and stuff. And he would have picked up on that, But blimey, probably about 200 people walking around that fun fair have had a wish granted to them. What's the big novelty about this kid? But yeah, it's a fair point, I guess.
So that'd be the sort of thing you wouldn't like if you were watching Die Hard, where he wouldn't survive that.
Yes. That would be a classic for my dad. He wouldn't stop talking through that. I bet.
Well, after Josh and Billy, Billy goes back and. But they start looking for the Zoltar machine, and it is, for people who were kids in that era, and watching the film now, where it's got all these sort of vintage arcade and pinball machines as they go hunting for Zoltar. It's real sort of retro heaven type. And eventually they realise that he has to get a job and everything, and so he goes to work for a toy company, because I suppose if you're a 12-year-old kid, you've got a natural advantage, which we do kind of explore a bit later on, because he does get seemingly an entry-level job as a computer sort of data inputter. His interview for the job, he does very Forrest Gump. That was one thing that in my head, he just sort of, when they said your social security number's too short, it just went 12. It just seemed a little bit that sort of simple answer as you do. But once he gets the job, and he gets what I would find an immense pleasure in working with John Lovitz, which he's in sleazy form. That seems he's done quite well. The job market in the 80s must have been quite difficult. He gets in there straight away, and one of the first things he does is phones his mum as the kidnapper. She still shows some self-awareness in asking for, essentially a proof of life, which involves him singing "The Way We Were" down the phone, which I'd be embarrassed doing now. I'd be embarrassed doing at 12. He's embarrassed, but still does it.
That's right. It's interesting looking at the guys in the, like John Lovitz's character in the background, like looking at Josh, like, what the hell's he doing singing in an office? Like, this is an office. What is he singing on the phone for? But yeah. And also another nice little sort of thing as well, which is a recurring theme, is just how well Tom Hanks deals with the whole notion of acting like a 12-year-old, even though obviously he's not at the time. So like when he's singing down the phone, he's sort of going, memories, the corners of my mind, and he's sort of like la-la-lying through it like a kid would do. And even in other aspects of the film, like when he's running along, he runs like a 12-year-old. Apparently there was this thing that he, because the young Josh, David Moscow, who plays young Josh, he was wearing, I think, Converse boots, which were like about one or two sizes, or I think they were just naturally big shoes anyway, compared to other equivalent brands. So he had this gait when he ran that he sort of ran in a slightly clumsy sort of fashion. And so apparently Tom Hanks said, give me a pair of shoes that are too big for me because I want to run like him. And all this attention to detail was lovely. They didn't just Tom Hanks didn't just act like an adult. He acted like he was still young. And that thing where he's singing down the phone, it's nice. He's sort of, he's just getting the words out just to convince his mum that he's got the right song, basically.
Yeah, and again, that time was when John Lovitz was sort of showing him around and pointing things out. And he said about the lady in the red dress, he said, "Oh, if she'll wrap her legs around you so tight," and that was when he went, "Oh, I'll stay away from her then," and not with any sarcasm or with any sort of adult awareness. It was purely like, as a 12-year-old kid, I suppose you're on that cusp, aren't you? But women and girls are only just about starting to become this thing.
Yeah, and he's looking at Josh to say, like, are you being ironic, or is that very dry humour, or are you for real?
But say, working for a toy company, I suppose it's and as an adult with some disposable income as well. But well, as a 12-year-old with disposable income, the first thing you do is go to the toy shop, and FAO Schwartz is kind of New York's equivalent of Hamleys. Goes in there, plays with all the toys, and a lot of those I remember as well. I think the one with the laser gun and the helmets, I had that. I think it was called like Photon or something like that. We used to have them, me and my brother, and it just, again, like most things, descended into physical violence. But most of, like, he bumps into his boss. This is Robert Loggia, isn't it? Who's, I think we were introduced very briefly to, because he bumped into him while he was running, and it turns out that he goes there every week to sort of check out the competition and so on. And we see how Josh gets his sort of competitive advantage in the field, where he is a 12-year-old boy and he's a marketer's dream. Most of the toys are going to be aimed at people like him and his demographic. So he knows exactly what to market to. But this is probably the iconic scene of the film where they're walking along and just happen to bump and step onto the piano on the floor.
Yeah, the big walking piano, which of course is the scene everyone remembers. It's kind of nicely set up that where they discover that, because as you say, they're fooling around Josh and he's playing with this sort of this photon thing that you just mentioned, and he discovers his boss Macmillan, and then they accidentally step onto this piano, and of course Josh thinks this is amazing. He's never seen one of those before. That's what many people had at the time in 1988. That would have been seen as like incredible technology, having a piano you could walk along. But having done so, Josh starts playing this tune, which is Heart and Soul. Now, I don't know about you, Rich. It seemed to me quite a familiar tune. Like I'd
Yeah.
heard it before. And yet, having looked into it, I mean, it's a Hoagie Carmichael song. It came out in 1938. But when you hear the original, because I had to YouTube it to find out what the original was like, and I don't really recognise it. So I can only guess it's familiar because it's one of those songs you learn how to play the piano with. Like, is it like a simple, repetitive melody?
Yeah, I think
But anyway,
Macmillan mentions that actually when he says sort of piano lessons. I
yeah.
think when they start playing it, and again, it's a tune or a harmony that you recognise, but I mean, I couldn't have placed the song, but I absolutely recognise the music.
Indeed, and because like afterwards, after they play that tune together on the keyboard, I think Macmillan says chopsticks, and then they play that as well. So I guess they're both just tunes that people learning to play the piano sort of get to play. But the scene is totally iconic, really, and they separately like jump around on this keyboard playing Heart and Soul, and of course, as you know, in the background, everyone starts to gather around, thinking, "Oh, this is something." There's two guys playing a tune together, like a duet, and you probably know or you may have heard about the backstory to this, which is when they were on set. They arrived on the set for the day to do this scene, and I think Tom Hanks spotted somebody dressed like him, a sort of body double, who was going to play that scene if he couldn't. And so he spoke to Robert Loggia and sort of said, "Look, we've got to do this, right? Because if we don't do it, we're going to get replaced in the film in this scene." So apparently they practiced and practiced and practiced like mad, and that's why there's no camera trickery in that scene. They are actually doing it for real, and it's bloody good as well, how they do it. And it's a really great story in that respect, that they didn't want to sacrifice their starring role to some couple of unknowns doing it in their stead.
But that's the thing, and it shows it's that authenticity where you would have lost probably a lot of the magic from that had it been lots of shots of them from the waist up and then lots of other shots from the sort of knees down, and it would have been quite obvious back then, you know, special effects and CGI and so on, where it wasn't them doing it, but the fact that it was them, and even with the obvious age difference and that they looked so involved and that they were really just doing it for fun, that that's one of the reasons I think that made it so popular.
Yeah, and you can see if you watch carefully where there's steps on that keyboard, there are a couple of times where they accidentally step onto an adjacent key, and that proves it's not, because they did it in like one take, and that proves that it wasn't camera trickery or anything like that. That was done for real, and I'm not criticising that. Oh, he stepped on the wrong key. It's great to actually see that. That's real stuff.
They're humans after all.
Yes, indeed.
Macmillan obviously realises that Josh is special or gifted or whatever, immediately promotes him to vice president of one of the research departments, which gets a lot of people's nose out of joint. And this is where we're really properly introduced to Paul and Susan. So Susan is Elizabeth Perkins, who goes on to be the love interest, and Paul is John Hurd, who probably most people remember as the dad from Home Alone, also the very bad dad. He is an arsehole of the highest order in this. It's, I mean, the film's made, or certainly released, not far after Wall Street, and that where there is that sort of view of Manhattan being, you know, you've got to be that ruthless type, and he is, but he's still quite quickly shown up by Josh, you know, 12-year-old boy, let's not forget, in their first meeting where they're trying to pitch the idea of, is it the Empire State Building as a transformer?
Yeah, a sort of building / robot idea, yeah.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that it's an idea that obviously they've got a prototype there and Josh is playing around with it. But this was sort of peak Transformers time as well, so kind of resonates quite quickly with that.
Yes, and it's actually quite interesting. Funnily enough, I didn't really pick up on it in the first viewing, but actually, particularly in that sort of sequence of the film, there's many references to things like Transformers and also certain toy brands as well, like Mattel, I think is mentioned, and Fisher Price, and you sort of wonder whether they kind of got clearance to mention them, or whether they just sort of thought, well, we're not sort of slagging them off or anything. We're just, but it adds a nice sort of element of reality to the thing. Really, it was quite amusing though when Josh is sitting in this meeting, this presentation, and he's sort of playing with this kind of building robot, and he sort of accidentally breaks the arm off of it and stuff, and of course we get another insight then into the fact that Josh still is a kid, and he still thinks like a kid, and he hasn't got the filter to put his words across it tactfully. You know, like there's literally what he's thinking comes straight out of his mouth, and so he puts his hand up in the meeting and says, like, I don't get it. And this John Hurd character, Paul, who's doing the presentation, says, well, what don't you get? And he sort of says, well, it's not very interesting. No kid's going to be interested in a building that converts into a robot, and absolutely right too. Nor would I have been when I was that age. And he then sort of says, "What about a robot that converts into a bug?" Which everybody in the meeting suddenly says, "Oh, great idea, great idea." Slightly sort of overplayed in a sort of Hollywood way, like everybody gets behind Josh and not him. But it only serves this vehicle really, which is that it sets up the good guy and the bad guy, which of course really good films do have that element in them if it allows for it. And of course we're all sort of behind Josh because he's the kid, he's the who we're all focusing on. And then this John Hurd character, I mean, he plays it brilliantly. He's a real baddie, as you say. He's nasty piece of work, and this is where the antagonism sort of creeps in, because everybody throws their weight behind this new idea, or these new ideas that Josh is throwing out for Insecticons and stuff like that. And so Paul gets envious of him and starts to wonder, where this Josh guy has come from, and why has he been promoted so quickly.
One of the things I found funniest about that was where Josh is playing with the toy and most of the other people in the meeting room are smoking, because it was
Yes.
It was cool back then, I suppose. After this, and there's the scene where Josh, and with Billy helping him, gets their loft apartment, which is filled with pinball machines and the sort of stuff that a 12-year-old would decorate their bedroom with if they had money.
Yeah.
But because Josh, he's now a vice president and he gets invited to the corporate party with all the bigwigs. Now, Macmillan's already made the joke about, tuxedos, looks the same as the butlers and everyone else. Josh rocks up, and this is almost... You can see where Dumb and Dumber got the idea from, of turning up in the most ridiculous tuxedo, like something Liberace would wear. It's white, covered in cubic zirconia nonsense. But really, fair enough. A lot of people start laughing, and he does look quite self-conscious about it. But he walks in like, this is a party. I'm here, and kind of, let's say, takes over. But he certainly, once he gets over that initial nervousness about being laughed at, he really does start again, like as a 12-year-old. What would a 12-year-old do full of drunk adults? It's like being at a wedding.
Yeah. And I think what's sort of interesting as well is this is a phase, a sort of period in the film where you're not seeing much of Billy. So you're sort of wondering, I wonder if Billy was involved, whether in terms of hiring that suit, whether Josh had to do that all by himself. Because I think if Billy had been with him, he would have steered him towards something a bit more conventional. But yeah, that's quite an entrance. That's another kind of well-remembered part of the film. And again, it's because there's no filter there. He's a bit sort of self-conscious, but he thinks, well, okay, people seem to be pointing at me and laughing at me, but I'm just going to go over and start eating stuff. So he just gets on with it, and it's quite nice in that respect. But of course, highly amusing the way he actually eats the food that's there.
Yeah, because the baby corn bit, he's eating it like a regular, and that's where Susan kind of looks at him and thinks, "Wow, this guy's." There was a cross between, there was an attraction, and obviously a kind of weird fascination into this man-child, and I suppose that's quite a common term these days, of the fact that when she goes over and talks to him, and this is beluga caviar, this, that, and the other. And I've never had caviar. I almost certainly never will. I
No.
think I would react in almost exactly the same way Josh does, by spitting it out. And
Gagging.
yeah, I mean, I can't remember what
Yeah.
film it was where they had caviar, and there was a part where they said, "Oh, don't worry about the taste; you'll grow to like it." And
All right.
that was kind of, I suppose it's one of those things that if you have it enough, yeah, you probably might. But and as a sign of wealth. But this is a 12-year-old kid who's probably idea of a perfect meal is a Big Mac.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a mention. I think Susan says something like, "Oh, he, as in the boss, orders it every year," and she's like, "It was just, it is one chance to have some caviar, so just eat it." And yeah, I've never eaten caviar either, by the way. I just want to sort of throw that in. You're not alone on that. But he does this brilliant sort of comedy gagging where he sort of realizes how disgusting it tastes, and there was a bit of that. Tom Hanks, it was one of his little sort of calling cards in some of his films. Like I remember. I think it was in The Money Pit, where he near enough sort of falls through the floor, and he just sort of has this he does this hysterical laughter, which just gets me every time. And similarly, this where he sort of chokes on this caviar and tries to spit it out. It just gets me giggling, really, because again, it's sort of childish or childlike, very authentic. The reaction to it. But he sort of says something like, "Oh, can I?" She says, "Are you okay?" And he sort of says, "Can I have a milkshake?" Which you're not going to get at a corporate works do.
No.
And that's when she sort of thinks, "Well, I'm bored stupid at this event. There's people talking about the same old stuff." She's tried a bit of small talk with the boss about work stuff, and he doesn't want to know because he's trying to just enjoy himself. So that's when she sort of suggests to him that they just go somewhere else, basically.
I mean, she's quite forward, and as we learn, it's not blatantly obvious at this point, but her and Paul are a couple, and yet, Paul's there. He's drunk and that, but she's very forward in saying to Josh, "Let's get out of here." Getting in her car and going off and going back to his place. I suppose that's, if this was a role reversal thing, yeah, you'd expect a bloke to be that forward. The only thing I find really unnerving is the fact that, this is a woman, probably, I don't know, 30, mid-30s. Not that she knows it, but basically hitting on a 12-year-old. And his behaviour is part of what appeals to her. Whether it's trying to, because she's quite straight-laced at this point, she does seem to loosen up throughout the film, and almost like discovering her inner child in certain scenes. And maybe that's part of what appeals. But yeah, it was very forward, and the fact that when he gets in a limo, starts pressing all the buttons and doing all the stuff that, and again, as putting yourself in that position as a 12-year-old kid, think you're being in a limo, you think, blimey, I've made it.
Yeah, he starts playing with the radio and stuff, and jumping up and sort of standing through the sunroof and everything. Yeah, it's interesting because the Susan character then has to sort of try and meet him halfway, shall we say, like instead of being so starchy and mature, that she sort of thinks, well, he's clearly a bit immature, but I could get to like him if I just loosened up a bit. And that's where you're starting to sort of see that she's making a bit of an effort. But as you say, she's being being a bit of a predator about the whole thing, and sort of thinking, actually, I could really sort of score, literally, in this situation if I play my cards right. So it's kind of try not to think too much of that overtone. But it's interesting, and of course it culminates in a great scene there where they go past Josh's apartment and he sees it, and she says something like, "Oh, I've often wondered where you live," and he says, "I'll take you there." And then they go back to his apartment, where much hilarity ensues.
Yeah, I mean, the part I found the most amusing was the trampoline, where he really has to kind of drag her onto this trampoline. Obviously, it's a full-size one in his loft. That's a blatant death trap, being so close to the window. But I suppose 12-year-old.
I should say so.
But again, half of that dream is, having the arcade games and the vending machine stuff, which you can tell that she finds it very odd. But by the time they get into their bunk bed, because I suppose any sort of relations aren't going to be first thing on his mind. The last sort of shot of her in the bunk bed in his New York Jets top is her smiling, looking relaxed and comfortable. And that's kind of when you start to see her thinking, right, yeah, maybe this part of this might be good for her.
Yeah, an interesting sort of situation where, I mean, she sort of basically think he's not a typical guy, but that actually is a positive thing because he hasn't just immediately tried to jump me on the first date. He's actually sort of playing it cool, so maybe he can be trusted a bit more and stuff like that. But yeah, it's quite amusing, the line where they're just going into his apartment and he says something like, she says something like, "Oh, I'm not sure if this is the right thing to do," and he says, "What, like sleep over?" And she says, "Yeah." And he said, "It's okay." And then he comes out with the great line, he says, "As long as I get to be on top," which is a reference to the bunk bed. Great line. And this sort of slightly quizzical look on her face is like, wow. But yeah, and just another reinforcement of the notion of all these toys that he's got in his room and the pinball machines, as you say, and the basketball hoop and all that. Clearly, it seems a bit weird to her, but I guess she's probably sort of thinking, well, at least he's a bit more three-dimensional. He's just not your typical kind of boring guy. He's got a sort of different interest. He's a bit more interesting than the other guys. So yeah, maybe that's probably why she's sort of starting to look quite contented lying on her bottom bunk.
And then the next day, Josh and Paul end up having a racquetball match in the local neighbourhood, and there's clearly tension on Paul's part, certainly. And it ends up with Josh calling him out for cheating, and it just devolves into this petty, I don't even call it a fight, really, although I suppose that's how 12-year-old would fight mostly. It would be headlocks and sort of the odd push and things like that. But when he does get a punch and Susan sort of gives him the old TLC at the end, and when she goes to break up with Paul and give him his stuff back, she says to him, "Well, he's a grown-up."
Yeah, why do you like him? He's a grown-up.
Yeah, the 12-year-old kid is a grown-up and not the supposedly high-ranking toy man.
Yeah, the whole notion sort of turned on its head, really. Like, little do you know. And I have to say, I absolutely love that racquetball scene. I don't know why. It's just because it's the coming together of. It's like, dare I say, with some tongue-in-cheek, like Luke Skywalker meeting Darth Vader. Is kind of like they're at their peak good and peak badness of themselves, and they have. I think skirmish is probably the right word to use for that scene. But yeah. Yeah, even and this is another thing as well. Even when they're having this kind of tussle, Josh is still essentially acting like a kid. He's not sort of raising his fist for a fight. He's kind of he gets the ball that they're playing with, and he sort of holds it out to one side so that he can't get it, and then he uses it. Does the same with the other hand. It's just delightful that continuity of that immaturity that he has.
It's here then that Josh and Susan start dating. They cut to her place. She's clearly more relaxed. They go off for a date to a fairground, walking past the Zoltar machine. But they dance and it's all very sort of nice. Go back to her place, and then that's when they have their, she has her wicked way with him, or the other way around. And the 12-year-old boy escapes, or comes out, or however, grabs her chest, leaves the light on. And it's all very, that awkward 12-year-old where he kind of half staring, half, I want to soak all this up, or bad phrase maybe. But and obviously we don't really see anything. It's a PG, I guess. But then we know what's happened, because the next day he runs out the lift full of the joys of spring, clearly happy, high-fiving everyone. It's subtle.
Real spring in his step, felt. I wonder why. It's interesting actually, that scene, and it's obviously a continuity of the theme about what you're like when you're that age, and the fact that you haven't got this worldly wise experience that like speaking as a sort of someone in their mid-40s has, because there's an echo from a scene earlier in the film when Josh first starts his new job, and he bumps into his boss, and he catches a sight of Susan's. What should we say, cleavage, décolletage, the sort of low cut top that she's wearing, and he sees the sort of gap where you just see a hint of her bra. And then when they go back to her apartment and she sort of basically takes off her top, then he's really kind of staring at her bra. Then it's there sort of presented right in front of him. And he's sort of, as you say, it's that awkwardness of, I sort of shouldn't be doing this because I feel guilty. This is wrong. And yet, what an amazing opportunity. I'm kind of going to look at this and stare at you. And he sort of gently touches her and it's all a bit, I don't know if I should be doing this, but it gets you as a viewer, it gets you sort of thinking back, was I really like that myself? Like, did I have those kind of hesitancies when I was a kid? And I suppose for most of us, we did. I mean, not that I had ever had an opportunity like that, but
not at 12.
But that notion of, no, indeed. But that thing of like you're starting to become a little bit more sexually aware, but you kind of keep it to yourself. You don't even tell your parents what's going through your mind. You're sort of secretly observing things that are happening, like what you see on TV or in magazines and stuff, and you're trying to work it all out in your head. And I say for Josh, then he's presented with this opportunity to, well, he's standing right in front of a sort of semi-naked woman by the end of the scene. So quite a key point in the film, really.
Yeah, I suppose you all think you're James Bond or some super suave guy, and essentially you're a 12-year-old kid with a breast in your hand going, something at the bottom.
Yeah, apparently I read somewhere, I don't know if it's true or not, but I think initially they wanted to do the scene with Elizabeth Perkins ending up topless. And I'm actually glad they didn't, just to keep the subtlety there, you know? She didn't need to be. It was enough just for him to see her staying there in a bra sort of thing. And yeah, that was whoever had made the decision to sort of keep it more subtle, I think deserves a pat on the back.
But at this point, you know, they're dating, and there's that really over sweet bit at the dinner party where he goes and helps the kid do his algebra homework and all that is a bit weird. But Billy sort of reemerges and turns up because while all this has been happening, I suppose, you know, 4 to 6 weeks has passed, and the local authority have sent him the list of Zoltars or where they should be. And he rocks up at the office, and this is where Josh is now becoming corporate man. He's got his phone call, he can't hang up for Billy, and then they have a bit of a falling out, and I guess it was inevitable really, was, you know, Josh grows into this, the person that he's pretending to be is that he's actually becoming.
Yeah.
And Billy finds it all a bit too much.
Yeah, I sort of found it, it was almost frustrating, really, because you got the feeling that Josh was then thinking, hey, I'm getting the hang of being this adult. You know, I've just had some kind of sexual conquest with a woman, and I'm now kind of quite a big deal at work. I've got a top job. I'm earning lots of money. And it's almost like he's starting to believe himself that actually, yeah, I'm an adult now. And as a viewer, you're thinking, no, don't go that far. Don't get hooked into it, you know, because it's once you become an adult, that's it then. You cross the line and you have to sort of leave behind your childhood to some extent. So you're willing him not to get too carried away with it. And it's almost sort of quite sad seeing him having this falling out with Billy when Billy wants to, as you say, tell him this information about where the next fun fairs are going to be, and it's like, sorry, I'm a bit busy now, come back later, and it's kind of heartbreaking almost.
Yeah, and it's where Josh seems to realise that too, because he goes on a little sort of journey, as it were. He goes back to where he's from and starts staring at kids and standing by watching them having their photos taken. I'm sure the local police would want to know who this guy is.
Yeah.
And he starts to realise that these people they're still living the childhood that he's kind of given up in a way. And of course he feels that he has to tell Susan the truth. And I suppose, you know, that must be on both sides. Imagine telling someone that.
Yeah, and again another echo from the early scene when he's trying to tell his mum. It's that whole process all over again of trying to get the point across. And it's interesting where there was something you said earlier on about the film about I think it was just about the Zoltar machine. You know, why did it work on some people and not on others? I find it kind of interesting how only Billy is convinced that this really is Josh, whereas his Susan doesn't get it. She doesn't believe him, and his mum doesn't believe him. So, like, well, that's being my dad again. Oh, that's convenient for the film's purposes, you know. But yeah, as you sort of rightly say, Susan just doesn't believe him. When it's quite funny that when he says, "Look, I just want to go home." And then she says, "Oh my God, you're married!" Like she thinks he's saying, "I want to go back to my family and my wife." And he says, "No, I'm not married." And it takes obviously a bit of convincing, but she works it out eventually, of course.
The thing I kind of skipped over it when earlier on when Josh does convince Billy that it's Josh, and they sing that bloody annoying song.
Oh yeah, that sort of rap thing.
Oh God, I hated that when I was a kid, and watching it again, Jesus. But yeah, and I imagine if you're Josh talking to Susan, and some of us have used elaborate mistruths in the past to escape from people, and I suppose she's probably sitting there thinking, oh, "Okay, right, I've heard them all." Okay, yeah, I'm 12. Yeah, sorry, I can't be with you anymore. And obviously for her having to hear this again, if the shoe was on the other foot, as it were, if you're going out with someone who turns around and says, "Actually, I'm a 12-year-old girl," that's like one of those online chat rooms with a police officer doing it.
Yes,
we're going down that dark path again. Sorry. She does seem to. I mean, it takes her a while, but I think because they're working on this project about the computer game in the comic book and doing their presentation. But she kind of realizes when he's doing the presentation that because she's now looking for a 12-year-old boy, she now kind of sees it. She sees his behavior, and especially when Paul starts giving it the old "I don't get it," putting him off, and that's really when she says, "Right, yeah, I think he is." And she bumps into Billy, who gives her where the Zoltar machine is. But yeah, she sort of leaves this meeting with him to follow him. It's that bit comes around quite quickly, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Because one minute Josh is sort of saying to Susan, "Look, I'm 13 years old or whatever, and she's misunderstanding." Then you go straight into this scene with the presentation about the electronic comic books, and Josh leaves, and she thinks, "Oh my God, there's something. He's clearly upset about something, or there's something on his mind that he needs to get out of this room quickly." And then, as you say, all of a sudden, she's sort of following him to wherever he's gone, which happens to be the location for the fun fair. Quite a charming little scene where she bumps into Billy, and he says, like, "Who are you?" And she says, "I'm his girlfriend," and he goes, "Well, there," like you would about just about girlfriends generally, perhaps before you fully sort of embrace the notion of having a girlfriend. It's girls. So and then Josh has gone, and he turns up in this wonderful location. I did actually read where that was in real life, but it's almost like a sort of I don't know, like an oceanfront kind of boardwalk sort of area. And mercifully, he's found another Zoltar Speaks machine, and then we sort of enter the sort of final furlong in the film, really. But yeah, you're right. It kind of suddenly rattles through very quickly. You're not allowed to really dwell on Josh's relationship with Susan is coming to an end. It's almost like the sort of director sort of saying, "Don't worry about that. Honestly, that's not the important stuff. We need to get to the end," and they do, of course.
Well, that part where they're on the boardwalk and he's made his wish, it kind of reminds me a little bit of almost Back to the Future, where he's saying to her, "Why don't you come with me?" It's trying to encourage her to do the same thing. Wish she was
Yes.
You know, and that's where she gives the good logic in my eyes anyway of saying, well, I've been there, I've done it. Why would I want to do it again? And it's true, you know. I mean, you've already done it. You know, you're doing it at the time, and you know, I'm sure people look back at it now and think, "Oh, great." But why? Yeah, essentially, this is where she kind of has to remind him that, you know, while they've had a nice sort of day in the sun and everything else, that, you know, they are in very different places in their life, and he has to go back to being the 12-year-old, 13-year-old, and she has to carry on being her. And then it starts coming out because he's made this wish and he's very confident that it's going to work. That's when she starts to sort of mother him a little bit,
Yeah.
where she's like, I'll take you home, when they're in the car, and she says, oh, you know, you're not going to forget about me. And he tries to kiss her and she kisses him on the forehead as a sort of, right, this definitely is now
Yeah.
the dynamic is changing.
Absolutely, yeah. I think I read somewhere that they were going to do it like she was going to kiss him on the lips, but that would have seemed obviously wrong in the sense of, you know, basically she would have been kissing in essence a 13-year-old boy, which I think they made the right decision with that as well. But I love there's a bit of dialogue following on from what you just mentioned a minute ago when you know, he tells her he's really 13. And he suggested that she could come back with him, sort of in younger form, shall we say? And she says, "No, I've been there before. It's hard enough the first time." But then she says, "You know what I mean?" And then she says, "Oh no, you don't know what I mean," because he's still only 13. And so that's a lovely line there. It's just a final kind of confirmation to her of like, oh God, yeah, there's this age difference. Like I didn't know about it before. Yeah, and so she sort of finally says, "Okay, I get it," and yeah, she sort of takes him back, and it's sad, but not in a kind of yucky, sort of emotional, sickly sweet way. It's sort of sad, as in like clearly things were working out for them, but it couldn't go on. You know, he has to go back. And it's almost like a sort of resignation of like, well, you know, might as well just sort of finish this off now, and I'll take you back to your childhood home. Really,
I mean, I again don't want to look too much into the logic of these things, but he's so convinced that this Zoltar is going to work, it's going to turn him back, and then so he leaves. He gets out of the car, starts walking back to the house, and it's almost like, and again, another Tom Hanks thing, like Toy Story, where as soon as she doesn't look, he changes.
yeah.
You know, he turns from the toy into Woody or whatever. So dogs just looked at me when I said Woody. And
Random.
he knows his name. But this is where, you know, as soon as she turns away, he becomes Josh, the boy again, in the big oversized suit. And he gives this sort of look of, yeah, I remember you. She takes it all very well. I suppose she smiles and goes, "Oh, that's sweet." As soon as he goes back to the house, drives off. She doesn't hang around. Probably goes back to Paul. But yeah, that's again seeing the boy in the man's suit just kind of brings it home. Really, the difference, obviously physically, but he just looks so lost. You know, he's drowning in this double-breasted suit.
I remember when I was watching that, I think the first time I ever saw that, which would have been not long after it came out, probably would have been on TV at the time in the early 90s. And I remember sort of rather pathetically getting quite choked up about that because it was just like, you know, it's almost changing before your eyes. It's interesting they didn't do a sort of CGI thing of actually making him morph down into a kid in real time, which I think was good as well. But there's some doubt for me as to this thing where, as you say, she looks away and looks back up at him, and he's in a blink of an eye, he's changed instantly. Because it's like, well, yeah, but last time it took you like an overnight period to change. Presumably, there was a howling wind outside and blah blah blah, and you woke up like that, and now just conveniently, as he's about to walk in through the front door, he's just shrunk almost instantly. But I mean, obviously it's a cinematic device, but it kind of works. It fits the scene pretty well, and just seeing him, as you quite rightly say, sort of drowning in that suit, a nice touch really, just brings it home and underlines the change in age once again that he has.
Yeah, I think it's good that it keeps it that simple. The fact that it doesn't show some sort of weird metamorphosis almost. It's probably, yes, we know it's happened, even if it's happened in half a second. But I think to do it that way just keeps the sort of fantasy, it keeps it real.
Yeah.
And we'd have ended up with some really bad special effects. But, ultimately, it's returned back to normal. And I do wonder if it goes back to Mum and what sort of condition mentally is he going to be in. She thinks he's been kidnapped. At one point, I forgot to mention, his face is on the side of a milk carton as a missing child.
Yes.
So obviously come back and we're looking at 4, 6, 8 weeks even. There's a lot to go to talk through. He's going to need a lot of therapy, I think.
Yeah, it went through my mind as well. Like, what would the next period have been like for him and his mum? Because I guess Josh has to then carry on this pretense of I've been kidnapped. He can't just sort of say, well, actually, what happened was I woke up one morning, I was big, because she would still not believe that. So the only thing she would presumably believe is I've been kidnapped, to which she would then have been sort of asking him questions like, well, where did you go? Who was this guy? How did he treat you? And you'd have been going nuts trying to invent scenarios for that as a kid, just to keep your mum happy. So that would have been an intriguing one.
If she says, "Oh, who kidnapped you?" and he'd have to turn and go, "Well, remember that film Dragnet?" And the bloke in that.
Yeah, that's right. That would have been convenient.
Yeah.
I forgot what I was going to say now. It's another nice sort of touch as well. Another way they I think sets this film apart from those other kind of body swap films that you said earlier on was they do seem to have made the right judgment call at the right times. Like at the end, you don't see him in his house with his mum. You just hear her sort of so relieved and emotional that he's walked in through the front door again for the first time in weeks. And it's that sense of elation and emotion that I think probably got me choked up before, because you're imagining what a relief that must have been. But I remember my English teacher at school telling us at some point that when you're writing a story, you don't have to explain everything if you just kind of leave a gap, and then that allows people to kind of imagine the rest and fill the gap themselves. And that's obviously clearly they took a leaf out of his book, because they sort of did exactly that. It was exactly the right thing to do. A bit like the sort of radio principle, really, of sort of painting your own pictures in your mind.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you have to allow the audience or whoever to have that little bit of imagination and see that. You've got to give them some credit somewhere.
Yes.
Well, that's big. Luckily, I suppose we haven't had Big 2. I guess that would be a bit weird. And even now, I think Tom Hanks has moved away mostly from comedy, save Toy Story and the odd cameo here and there. I think it's one of those that I'm surprised, and even then, it's probably been remade 100 times in a different name. It's one of the easy tropes of Hollywood to go into, like Freaky Friday or something like that. But yeah, I think it's very much of its time, and we'll leave it there. And I think nostalgia and perhaps a little bit of fantasy takes that one a long way.
Yeah, it's a delightful, it's a charming film. It's this strange paradox. It's one that's highly regarded by a lot of people, but you can pick it up still for like £3 in a discount bin in a high street shop. It's an odd thing, but people do regard it quite highly, probably for the nostalgia as much as anything else.
Yeah, and just what I will play the podcast out when we finish, just to show the nostalgia value. Number one in the UK at the time of the film's release was One Moment in Time by Whitney Houston, which dates it very nicely at October 1988.
I thought you were going to play something by Billy Idol because he crops up about 3 times musically in the film. It would have been a more fitting tribute, possibly. But we'll go with Whitney Houston for the time being.
Yes. Well, Chris, thank you very much for joining us to talk about Big. It was a long time in the making, but very worth the wait. You, as part of one of the many projects that you do, Kit Bliss is kind of the main one that you're pushing and promoting at the moment. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Certainly, I'd be happy to. Thank you. Yeah, it's just without getting sort of too far afield from talking about movies. One of my hobbies, rather strangely, is that I'd like to illustrate football kits. I've been a football fan all my life, and I sort of like anything to do with kind of graphic design and branding and stuff. And so combining those interests, I've got this website called kitbliss, kitbliss.co.nz. And it's basically like an ever-growing online series of galleries where essentially I'm chronicling football kit design, I should say. Excuse me. So you can basically look at the various kits that were worn by different teams and see how football kit designers have developed. So it's just a little harmless hobby of mine that I have. So if anybody's interested in that kind of thing, by all means, go along and have a look at the website. It's just a little sideline I have.
There's quite a bit in there that certainly appealing to a nostalgic audience, where I know that the one that you did a while ago about if a TV studio was a football kit, and again it was bringing back some of the memories about that. And I know some of the iconic stuff that you're looking at the moment is the shirts or kits that your contributors remember from a certain period of time. And I know we discussed doing one that I might do about an Arsenal kit from, in fact, the season that Big came out in, that 88-89 season, where, again, it was that happy period that I'll always remember. And football kits and films, maybe it is that sort of time for nostalgia, and we all seem to remember one or more from when we were a kid.
Yeah, I've always been into nostalgia, TV nostalgia, football nostalgia, so that's me all over, really. So this Kit Bliss website is sort of very much part of all of that.
And I suppose on a similar note, one of the future episodes that we've got lined up for this, we'll be looking at the World Cup films of 1982 and 1986, which...
Can't wait for that.
They'll be an absolute treat because they also star Sean Connery and Michael Caine.
A warning for dodgy impersonations of both coming up, I'm sure.
Yeah, and there is the odd sort of xenophobic stereotype comment of particularly the 82 one, if I remember correctly. Yes.
Yeah. Yes, we'll cover that in due course.
Well, hopefully I can be a bit more responsible, and we can actually try and get that one out coming up to the World Cup this year.
Indeed. I look forward to that.
Well, Chris, again, thank you very much for joining us for Big. And as mentioned earlier, I'm going to treat you all to a bit of Whitney Houston. That's One Moment in Time. Chris, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Rich.
This podcast is part of Britpod Scene, an independent network of uniquely British podcasts that's always growing. Check out BritpodScene.com or BritpodScene on Twitter to find out more.